In 2023, a new ketamine clinic opened somewhere in the United States every 34 hours. Not a pharmacy, not a hospital wing, a clinic, built specifically, exclusively around one molecule. Reclining chairs, soft lighting, noise-cancelling headphones, and an IV drip carrying a drug that was invented in 1962 to keep soldiers alive on jungle floors. By the end of that year, there were more than 750 of them operating across the country, in strip malls and medical parks, in cities and suburbs, in states where the same molecule was simultaneously being seized by police at nightclubs 40 minutes down the highway. That is where the story begins. Not with a discovery, not with a tragedy, with a paradox. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. The same drug, 3 completely different worlds, all happening at once. To understand how that is even possible, it helps to start with a number that is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. Over the course of recorded medical history, ketamine has been administered to human beings more than 300 million times. That is more than any other anesthetic still in active clinical use anywhere on Earth. It has been dripped into the arms of premature infants in neonatal units and injected into combat soldiers in the middle of firefights. It has been dissolved into drinks at parties, snorted off bathroom counters at raves, and administered under careful psychiatric supervision to people who had not felt anything close to hope in years. The same molecule, every time, 300 million doses across 6 decades, and the world is still arguing about what it is. Here is what makes that number stranger still. Ketamine has never been fully legal, never been fully illegal, and never been fully understood. It sits in a regulatory category called Schedule 3 in the United States, which means the government officially considers it to have medical value and moderate abuse potential simultaneously. That classification was arrived at in the year 2000, after 30 years of use, after the drug had already been through at least 3 entirely separate cultural lives. By the time the paperwork was filed, millions of people had already made up their own minds about what ketamine was, and almost none of them agreed. It is the only drug ever deployed as a battlefield anesthetic on every inhabited continent. It has been on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, meaning it is classified as a basic human necessity since 1985. It has also been found in the systems of people who died in nightclubs in Manchester, Hong Kong and Miami. In 2019, the FDA approved a version of it for treatment-resistant depression, the first genuinely new antidepressant mechanism approved in over 50 years. 50 years! An entire half-century of psychiatric research, and the best answer turned out to be hiding inside a drug that teenagers had been using to hallucinate in warehouse raves since 1992. None of that was planned, none of it was predicted, and none of it happened by accident. This is a story about a molecule that kept escaping the container it was put in. Every time medicine tried to define it, anesthetic, controlled substance, antidepressant, the drug moved sideways into a life no one had authorized. It crossed from laboratory to battlefield to dance floor to psychiatric clinic, and at every stage the people inside the story were certain they understood what they were dealing with. They were certain. Every single time. They were wrong. Every single time. In a Vietnamese jungle in 1968, a field medic named records only as Corpsman D pushed ketamine into the arm of a soldier with a stomach wound so severe that conventional anesthesia would have killed him faster than the bullet. The soldier survived. The medic wrote in his field notes that the drug was unlike anything he had used before. The patient remained conscious, eyes open, apparently calm, while his body went into full surgical numbness. It looked wrong. It worked perfectly. 27 years later, in a warehouse outside Manchester on a Saturday night in 1995, a 21-year-old student who gave her name as Kaz to a journalist covering the British rave scene described the same sensation in entirely different terms. Floating, watching herself from the ceiling. No pain anywhere, no self really. Just awareness, untethered, drifting through something she couldn't name. She paid £12 for it. She did it again the following weekend. 24 years after that, a 47-year-old university professor in New Haven, Connecticut, a man who had tried 11 different antidepressants over 16 years without meaningful relief, sat in a clinical chair with an IV in his arm and cried for the first time in 4 years. Not from distress, from something he later described to his doctor as the sudden, startling sensation of the weight being gone. It lasted, not forever, but it lasted long enough to matter. 3 people, 3 eras, 1 molecule, and between each of them, a chain of decisions, failures, discoveries, cover-ups, and accidents that stretches across 60 years and touches virtually every major institution in American and global medicine. The question is not whether ketamine is good or bad. That framing collapsed decades ago under the weight of evidence pointing in every direction at once. The real question, the one that runs underneath every chapter of this story, is how a single compound synthesized in a Detroit laboratory by a chemist trying to solve a very specific, very limited medical problem ended up inside the veins of soldiers, partygoers, children, veterans, addicts, and the severely mentally ill, often at the same historical moment, often without the people in each group knowing the others existed. How does something created entirely for good become simultaneously a crisis and a cure? That question doesn't have a clean answer. What it has is a history, and the history starts not with the drug itself, but with the drug it was built to replace, something far darker, far more dangerous, and almost entirely forgotten now, which is exactly why it matters so much to what came next. The drug ketamine was built to replace was called phencyclidine. Most people know it by a different name, PCP, angel dust. And in the late 1950s it was considered one of the most promising anesthetics ever synthesized. That requires a moment to sit with. PCP, the drug associated with superhuman violence, with people tearing through police cars with their bare hands, with psychotic breaks so severe that emergency rooms developed specific containment protocols, was once a legitimate, heavily funded medical research project. Park Davis, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in America at the time, believed it was on the edge of something transformative. PCP produced deep anesthesia without suppressing breathing. It was stable at room temperature. It was easy to manufacture. On paper, it was almost perfect. The first human trials told a different story. Patients waking from PCP anesthesia described experiences that had no clinical framework at the time. Some became convinced they were dying. Others entered states of rigid catatonia, eyes open, bodies locked, minds apparently somewhere else entirely, that lasted not minutes but hours after the drug should have worn off. A subset of patients developed full psychotic episodes that persisted for days. One documented case involved a patient who, 48 hours after a routine surgical procedure with PCP anesthesia, was found trying to leave the hospital through a third-floor window because she was certain she was already home. Park Davis shut down the PCP program in 1965. The problem was not that the drug failed to work. The problem was that it worked on too much at once, numbing the body while detonating something unpredictable inside the mind. But the underlying need didn't disappear. Surgery still happened. Trauma victims still needed anesthesia. Children, burn patients, people in remote locations without access to full surgical facilities. All of them required something that could be administered quickly, safely, without specialized equipment, without the constant monitoring that general anesthesia demanded. The search for PCP's successor began almost before PCP itself was officially abandoned. Detroit, 1956. A Park Davis laboratory on the east side of the city, in a building that smelled permanently of industrial solvent and burnt coffee. A chemist named Calvin Stevens was working methodically through a series of compounds related to PCP, not trying to recreate it, but trying to find something in its chemical neighborhood that produced the useful effects without the catastrophic ones. Stevens was not a flamboyant scientist. His colleagues described him as precise, patient, and almost pathologically organized, the kind of researcher who dated every note in his lab journal to the hour, not just the day. He synthesized compound CE395 on a Tuesday. He noted its properties in his journal with the same careful handwriting he used for everything else. The notation was brief. The compound produced sedation in animal subjects. It appeared to cause a state he described tentatively as cataleptic, a word borrowed from neurology, meaning a kind of rigid trance-like stillness. The animals were not unconscious. Their eyes remained open. They did not respond to external stimuli. They appeared, in Stevens's careful phrasing, present but elsewhere. He didn't name it yet. He just kept notes. The animal trials continued through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s. Cats given C395 entered a state that was immediately recognizable as different from anything produced by conventional anesthesia. They didn't go limp. They went still. Alert stillness, a paradox in itself. Staring at nothing, unresponsive to touch, apparently feeling nothing, while their vital signs remained almost perfectly stable. Monkeys showed the same pattern. Researchers in the laboratory began using a new word to describe what they were seeing. The word was dissociation. Not in the psychiatric sense yet, just the plain language observation that the mind and body appeared to have temporarily separated. That word would follow this molecule for 60 years. By 1962, CW395 had a new name, ketamine. The naming was functional, not poetic, derived from the chemical structure, a ketone-amine hybrid. Stevens filed the patent. Park Davis moved toward human trials, and at this point, something important needs to be understood about the scientific climate of 1962, because it explains everything that happened next. American medicine in the early 1960s was operating with extraordinary confidence. Polio had been defeated. Antibiotics were transforming survival rates across virtually every category of infection. The FDA had just passed major new drug safety legislation following the thalidomide disaster in Europe, which meant the American regulatory apparatus believed itself to be finally airtight. Researchers were optimistic in a way that would seem almost naive from the outside of 50 years of subsequent history. When a new drug appeared to work without killing anyone, the prevailing instinct was not suspicion. It was momentum. The first human trial of ketamine took place in 1964. The location was Jackson State Prison in Michigan. The subject was a volunteer prisoner, a man whose name appears in clinical records only as EF, who received an intravenous dose and was monitored closely by a team led by a pharmacologist named Dr. Edward Domino and his colleague, psychiatrist Dr. Gwenta Corson. What EF experienced in that room was, by any measure, extraordinary. He remained conscious throughout. He responded to simple commands. His breathing was unaffected. His blood pressure stayed stable. But when asked afterward to describe the experience, he reached for language that didn't quite fit anything in ordinary life. He described feeling as though his mind had been lifted free of his body, as though he were observing himself from a small distance, as though the concept of where he ended and the room began had temporarily become unclear. He was not frightened. That was the detail that stopped Domino cold. PCP had produced a similar disconnection, but with terror attached. With ketamine, EF described something closer to calm bewilderment. He was confused but not distressed. He was elsewhere but not lost. The dissociation was there, intact, but the horror that had derailed PCP was absent. Domino sat with that finding for a long time before writing it up. It was Domino's wife, a non-scientist, who suggested the word that would define this drug class permanently. Looking over her husband's notes one evening, she read his descriptions of the disconnection between mind and body and offered a term she thought fit better than cataleptic or dissociative in its clinical sense. She suggested dissociative anesthetic. Domino used it in his published paper. It stuck. Every drug in this class, and there would be others, would carry that label ever after, all of them tracing their nomenclature back to a conversation in a Michigan kitchen in 1964. The paper was published. The pharmaceutical machinery began to move. Park-Davis filed for FDA approval. The agency reviewed the data, limited human trials, strong animal studies, a safety profile that looked genuinely superior to anything currently available, and began the evaluation process. There were questions. There were always questions. But the direction of momentum was clear. What no one asked, not Domino, not the FDA reviewers, not the prison volunteers, was what happened to the brain when this experience was repeated. Once was remarkable. Twice was a data point. What about 100 times? What about 1,000? That question wasn't on the form. The form didn't have a box for it. The FDA approval was granted in 1970. And the moment the paperwork was signed, ketamine stopped being a laboratory curiosity and became something else entirely. Something that would move through the world in ways Calvin Stevens, still keeping meticulous notes in his dated journal, could not have begun to anticipate. The military was already waiting. The first shipment of ketamine to reach Vietnam arrived in 1970, the same month the FDA signed the approval paperwork. The military hadn't waited for the ink to dry. They had been watching the trials. Vietnam was a different kind of war medically, not just tactically. The jungle made everything harder. Evacuation times, sterile conditions, the simple logistics of keeping a wounded man alive long enough to reach a surgical unit. Conventional general anesthesia required oxygen tanks, trained anesthesiologists, precise monitoring equipment, and a controlled environment. The jungle floor of the Mekong Delta provided none of those things. Soldiers were dying in the gap between the wound and the operating table, not because surgery wasn't available, but because getting them stable enough to survive transport was a problem that existing medicine hadn't fully solved. Ketamine solved it, almost immediately. The drug was lightweight, a small vial, a syringe, basic training. It didn't suppress breathing, which meant a field medic didn't need to manage a patient's airway while simultaneously keeping pressure on a wound. Blood pressure stayed elevated under ketamine, which was critical for trauma victims already in hemorrhagic shock. Most anesthetics drop blood pressure, which in a bleeding patient is a sentence, not a side effect. A medic with 3 weeks of training could administer a safe, effective dose in under 60 seconds. Field teams began calling it the buddy drug. 1 soldier, 1 vial, 30 seconds. The man on the ground stayed alive. Between 1970 and 1973, ketamine was administered to an estimated 500,000 wounded soldiers across the Vietnam theatre of operations. That number is not from a medical journal. It comes from military logistics records. The count of vials shipped, cross-referenced with casualty statistics. Nobody sat down afterward and conducted a formal clinical trial on outcomes. They didn't need to. The survival rates spoke. At the same time, the exact same months, the same calendar year, civilian hospitals across the United States were receiving their first ketamine shipments and discovering something the military already knew. The drug worked exceptionally well on children. Pediatric surgery had always been complicated by the fact that small bodies respond to conventional anesthesia unpredictably, with narrow margins between therapeutic and dangerous doses. Ketamine's safety window was wide. A child could receive a dose with far less precise calibration than morphine or halothane required, and the cardiovascular stability meant the surgical team could focus on the procedure rather than the anesthesia monitoring. Burn units became another major adoption site. Burn victims require repeated, frequent procedures, wound cleaning, dressing changes, skin grafts, that are excruciatingly painful, but often too short and too numerous to justify full general anesthesia each time. Ketamine could be used repeatedly across a single patient's recovery arc, in and out in under an hour, without the cumulative toxicity that other drugs accumulated. For a 7-year-old burn patient facing 40 separate procedures over 3 months, this was not a small improvement. It was the difference between treatment and torture. By 1973, ketamine had been added to the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. That designation carries specific meaning. It doesn't just mean the drug is useful. It means the WHO considers access to it a fundamental component of basic health care. A country without ketamine is, by that standard, a country with inadequate medicine. The listing would later make ketamine almost impossible to restrict globally, regardless of what evidence emerged about its other properties. That irony would take decades to fully develop. In 1973, it just looked like recognition. Then the reports started coming in, not publicly, not in journals, in the specific quiet language of clinical incident forms, the documents that hospital staff fill out when something happens that doesn't fit the expected outcome box. The forms went to department heads. Department heads forwarded some of them to medical directors. Medical directors, for the most part, filed them. The pattern inside the forms was consistent. Patients waking from ketamine anesthesia, not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to constitute a pattern across multiple institutions, were experiencing something that the standard anesthesia recovery checklist had no category for. They woke up in states of acute psychological distress unconnected to any physical sensation. Some were screaming, some were rigid and uncommunicative, some were clearly experiencing visual phenomena, tracking things that weren't in the room, reacting to events that weren't happening. One patient at a hospital in Baltimore woke from a routine gallbladder procedure and spent 45 minutes convinced, with complete certainty, that she was dead. Medical staff called these emergence reactions. The term was clinical, contained, and accurate as far as it went. It described the phenomenon, something happening during the emergence from anesthesia, without requiring anyone to address the mechanism. The forms went into folders. The folders went into filing cabinets. The drug kept shipping. Dr. Edward Domino, the pharmacologist who had named the dissociative effect after those first trials in Michigan, was aware of the emergence reaction reports. He had in fact documented several himself during the original human trials. He noted in his published paper that some subjects experienced vivid dreaming and perceptual disturbances during recovery. He recommended co-administration of benzodiazepines, sedatives that could blunt the psychological turbulence on waking. The recommendation was included in the clinical guidelines. Some hospitals followed it, many didn't. The benzodiazepines added cost, complexity, and time. The emergence reactions continued. What Domino could not have known in 1970, and what the incident forms couldn't capture, was that the emergence reaction wasn't a bug in the clinical situation. It was a window into the drug's actual mechanism. The patients weren't malfunctioning during recovery. They were recovering from an experience that the clinical framework around them had no language to describe. And somewhere in that gap between what the drug actually did and what medicine thought it did, the entire future of ketamine was quietly taking shape. In 1973, a researcher in California filed a brief 3-page incident report after observing something unusual in a post-operative ward. A patient, a middle-aged man who had undergone a knee procedure under ketamine, had woken from anesthesia with what appeared to be euphoria, not relief, not the ordinary post-surgical gratitude of pain finally managed. Euphoria. He had laughed. He had described the experience before the sedatives caught up with him as the most remarkable thing that had ever happened to his mind. The researcher noted it, forwarded the form, and then the same researcher noted something else, something she didn't include in the report but mentioned to a colleague in the hallway outside the ward. The patient had asked before he was fully alert whether he could have it again. The colleague laughed. The researcher didn't. That question, whether a surgical patient asking for more of an anesthetic the moment he woke from it should have been taken more seriously in 1973, would not receive a satisfying answer for almost 3 more decades. Meanwhile, ketamine kept moving. Out of the military, out of the burn units and pediatric wards, into the hands of the people who would carry it somewhere medicine had never intended it to go. The drug had already travelled further than Calvin Stevens ever planned. It was not finished travelling. To understand what ketamine actually does to a human brain, it helps to start with what pain is at the most fundamental level. Pain is information, a signal travelling up the nervous system translated into conscious experience by a region of the brain that processes threat and damage. The molecule responsible for carrying much of that signal across the gaps between nerve cells is called glutamate, the most abundant neurotransmitter in the human nervous system, present in nearly every major brain circuit. Glutamate binds to a specific receptor called the NMDA receptor. Think of the NMDA receptor as a gate. Glutamate is the key. When the key turns, the gate opens and the signal passes through. Ketamine blocks the gate. Not gently, not the way a painkiller dulls the signal at the source. Ketamine physically lodges inside the NMDA receptor channel and prevents glutamate from opening it at all. The signal still travels up from the wound or the burn or the surgical incision. It arrives at the gate. The gate doesn't open. The conscious mind never receives the message. The body is still being cut. The brain simply doesn't process it as pain. But NMDA receptors are not only involved in pain, they are threaded through the circuits that govern memory formation, the sense of time, the perception of where the body ends in space, and, most critically, the mechanism by which the brain generates what neuroscientists call the sense of self, the continuous background feeling of being a specific person in a specific body moving through a specific moment. Block enough NMDA receptors simultaneously, and that background feeling does not dim. It disappears. That is the dissociative state, not unconsciousness, disconnection. The clinical window, the period during which a standard anesthetic dose of ketamine produces surgical numbness, lasts between 20 and 45 minutes, depending on dose and body weight. During that window, patients breathe independently, maintain stable blood pressure, and keep their eyes open. To an observer, they look awake. To themselves, they are somewhere else entirely. This is the world Rosa Melendez entered every working day in 1977. She was 34 years old, a burn unit nurse at a regional hospital in San Antonio, Texas, with 7 years of clinical experience behind her, and a reputation among the surgical staff for being the person you wanted in the room when things went sideways. She had trained on conventional anesthesia protocols and switched to ketamine procedures when the burn unit adopted the drug in 1975. The transition had taken her approximately 2 weeks. That speed, 2 weeks to competency, was itself a testament to the drug's profile. Ketamine didn't require the years of specialized training that general anesthesia demanded. A skilled nurse could administer it safely. That accessibility was the point. Rosa's patients were burn victims. Their injuries range from industrial accidents to house fires to the specific terrible category of pediatric scalding. Children pulled from bathtubs, children who reached for pots on stoves. The procedures she assisted with were not dramatic surgeries. They were debridement, the careful, methodical removal of dead tissue from burn wounds, and dressing changes and skin graft preparations. Necessary, repetitive, without anesthesia, unsurvivable in terms of pain. With ketamine, they were survivable. She kept her own informal notes, not clinical records, but a small spiral notebook she carried in her scrubs pocket, where she logged observations the standard forms didn't capture. She noted that children recovered from ketamine faster than adults, typically returning to full awareness within 15 minutes of the dose wearing off. She noted that patients who received a benzodiazepine alongside the ketamine woke up quietly, while those who didn't sometimes woke up swinging. She noted the ones who asked questions during emergence, strange, floating questions that had no connection to where they were or why. One entry from March 1977 describes a 7-year-old boy. She never used names, only ages and injuries in her notebook, with third-degree burns covering his left arm and shoulder. He had undergone ketamine-assisted debridement 11 times across 8 weeks. By the 4th procedure, he no longer cried in the preparation room. By the 7th, he climbed onto the gurney himself and held out his arm for the IV without being asked. Rosa wrote 2 words in her notebook about that moment. Remarkable adaptation. She did not note whether she found this reassuring or not. The drug was working. She believed in it completely. Then there was the veteran. He arrived in the burn unit in October 1977, a man in his early 40s transferred from a VA hospital with burns to his hands and forearms sustained in an accident. Rosa's notes describe only as workshop fire. He had been in Vietnam. His intake form noted a history of what the VA called adjustment difficulties, which was the era's preferred administrative phrase for what would later be understood as post-traumatic stress disorder. He had never, according to his records, received ketamine in the field. He received it now for the first time in Rosa's unit. He did not come out of it quietly. 15 minutes after the dose began to wear off, before full consciousness had returned, he was no longer in San Antonio. Whatever the ketamine had done to his NMDA receptors, whatever gates it had blocked, whatever signals it had interrupted, when those gates began to open again, what came through was not a hospital room. He tore out his IV. It took 3 nurses to hold him. His chart entry afterward read, "Severe agitation on emergence, attributed to prior trauma history." The recommendation was to note the reaction and monitor more closely next time. There was no section on the form for what Rosa observed in those 15 minutes. No clinical language for the specific way a man's face looked when his mind returned from somewhere and found itself somewhere worse than where it had been. She wrote in her notebook that evening, 1 line. The drug brought him back, but not all the way. She locked the supply cabinet at the end of her shift that night, her standard last task, the one she never skipped. She checked the count of ketamine vials against the morning inventory. The number was correct, every vial accounted for. She would check that count every night for the next 2 years before she noticed something was wrong, and by then the discrepancy would not be hers to explain. The drug that Rosa trusted, that she administered to children and veterans and accident victims with steady hands and complete professional confidence, was already moving in directions her supply cabinet couldn't contain. The question wasn't whether ketamine had a life outside the burn unit. It already did. The question was who had taken it there and what they had found when they arrived. John Lilly was not the kind of scientist who stayed inside the laboratory. He had spent the 1960s attempting to communicate with dolphins, a project that attracted funding from NASA, the attention of the counterculture, and the sustained bewilderment of mainstream science in roughly equal measure. He had pioneered sensory deprivation research, spending hours suspended in flotation tanks in complete darkness and silence, charting the landscapes his mind produced when stripped of external input. He was brilliant, credentialed, and completely ungovernable by the norms of academic research. By the time ketamine entered his life in the mid-1970s, he had already been to places most scientists refused to acknowledge existed. He discovered ketamine through a physician contact. The drug was legal, pharmaceutical grade, available through medical channels to researchers with appropriate credentials. Lilly had appropriate credentials. He began self-administering. What followed was documented in a book he published in 1978, with a title that left nothing to interpretation: The Scientist. In it he described injecting ketamine intramuscularly, into the muscle, not a vein, a slower absorption that extended the experience, sometimes multiple times per day, across stretches of weeks. He described entering what he called alternate realities. He described encountering entities he believed to be genuinely external to his own mind. He described the dissolution of the boundary between self and universe, not as a side effect to be managed, but as the primary phenomenon of interest, the thing worth studying, the thing worth returning to. He was not embarrassed by any of it. That was the detail that mattered. Lilly's account reached exactly the population it needed to reach in order to change everything. The late 1970s American counterculture was post-LSD, post-Manson, post the dream collapsing, and actively searching for the next interior frontier. Psychedelics had been criminalized. The spiritual energy of the 1960s had nowhere obvious to go. And here was a credentialed scientist, not a dropout, not a street dealer, a man with a PhD and a Navy research contract, describing a legal pharmaceutical product as a doorway into experiences that dwarfed anything available on the street. Lilly's book became a cult document. It did not sell millions of copies. It didn't need to. It reached therapists, researchers, artists, and the specific networked subset of the counterculture that functioned as a distribution system for ideas. Within a year of publication, ketamine had a new audience, one that had never set foot in a burn unit or a field hospital and had no intention of doing so. But the first person documented to develop a compulsive relationship with ketamine was not a counterculture intellectual. She worked in a hospital in Ohio. Her name does not appear in any published study because her case was never published. What is known comes from the internal disciplinary records of the hospital, later obtained through a Freedom of Information request filed in the 1990s in connection with an unrelated pharmaceutical audit. She was a surgical nurse, 14 years of clinical experience. She had begun diverting ketamine from surgical supply, removing vials from inventory before the count, replacing them with saline-filled duplicates, sometime in late 1976. By the time she was discovered in early 1978, she had been using the drug for approximately 18 months, injecting it at home in a spare bedroom she had emptied of furniture and lined with pillows. Her husband believed she was working late. Her colleagues noticed nothing unusual in her performance. When confronted by the hospital director, she described the experience in terms that had nothing to do with recreation. She said she used it to feel like herself again. She said it was the only thing that stopped the specific, grinding weight she had carried for years without a name for it. She was not asking for sympathy. She was explaining a mechanism. She was fired. Her nursing license was suspended. The hospital filed the incident as controlled substance diversion and forwarded the documentation to the state medical board. Nobody sent it to a journal. Nobody sent it to the FDA. It went into a filing system and stayed there. What that case represented, a healthcare professional self-medicating with a dissociative anesthetic for what would now be recognized as treatment-resistant depression, would not be understood in those terms for another 25 years. In 1978, there was no framework for it. There was only the theft, the suspension, and the silence. The silence was everywhere that year. At Stanford, a team of researchers running a study on anesthetic agents in primates had been administering ketamine to a group of rhesus monkeys at regular intervals over 8 months. This study's primary focus was something else entirely. They were examining liver enzyme responses to a different compound, and ketamine was used as the procedural anesthetic. Almost as an afterthought, one researcher had been tracking neurological markers in the ketamine-exposed animals. At the end of the study, she ran the data and found something she hadn't been looking for. The monkeys who had received the most ketamine exposures showed measurable changes in prefrontal cortex activity compared to the control group. The prefrontal cortex governs executive function, impulse control, and, critically, the regulation of mood. The finding was not the study. It was a footnote. But she wrote it up, added it to the submission, and sent the paper to a major anesthesiology journal. The journal rejected the paper. The sample size was too small, 12 animals in the high exposure group, to support conclusions about neurotoxicity. The reviewer's note was 3 lines. The researcher filed the rejection, noted in her own records that a larger replication study would be needed, and moved on to her next project. The replication study would not be conducted for another 23 years. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Drug Enforcement Administration received its first formal intelligence report linking ketamine to non-medical use. The report had been compiled by a field office in California, based on interviews with informants in the Los Angeles underground drug scene. It was 3 paragraphs long. It described ketamine appearing at private parties, administered by injection, pharmaceutical vials, not street product, among a small network of individuals with connections to the medical community. The memo was classified as low priority. Ketamine was legal. The quantities described were small. The DEA had more pressing files. The memo was forwarded to the Narcotics Intelligence Division and logged. The log number was stamped in red ink on the upper right corner of the first page. 11 blocks from the DEA's Washington office, a congressman was delivering a speech to a medical industry conference about the future of American anesthesiology. He was optimistic. The field had never been safer. New drugs, better protocols, improved monitoring. He cited ketamine by name as an example of pharmaceutical innovation at its most responsible, a drug that solved a real problem without creating new ones. The audience applauded. The congressman thanked them. Outside, on the street, a cab driver had his radio on, and through the static, a news announcer was reading out the day's drug enforcement statistics. Heroin seizures, cocaine arrests, the ongoing effort to keep dangerous substances out of American communities. Nobody mentioned ketamine. There was no reason to, not yet. But in a hospital supply room in Ohio, a shelf sat slightly lighter than its paperwork claimed, and in a California laboratory, a filing cabinet held a rejected study that described changes in the brains of animals who had received the drug repeatedly. And in a Los Angeles field office, a 3-paragraph memo sat under a stack of higher priority files, its red stamped log number facing the wall. All 3 would eventually resurface, The question was which one would surface first, and what would already be irreversible by the time it did. The 1980s arrived and ketamine split into two parallel lives that almost never touched each other. In hospitals, it remained exactly what it had always been: essential, trusted, unremarkable in the way that only truly foundational tools become unremarkable. Burn units, pediatric wards, emergency rooms, rural clinics without full anesthesiology departments. The drug moved through these spaces without drama, doing what it had always done, administered by nurses like Rosa Melendez who had built entire professional identities around its reliability. The clinical world had absorbed ketamine so completely that questioning it would have felt like questioning the gurney. Outside the hospital, something quieter was beginning. Not a scene yet, not a culture, just a small, specific network of people in California who had read John Lilly's book and drawn their own conclusions about what ketamine was actually for. They were not teenagers. That detail matters. The first non-medical ketamine users of the 1980s were predominantly therapists, psychiatrists, and researchers, people with clinical training who believed, based on their reading of the dissociative experience, that ketamine could do something talk therapy couldn't. The theory was precise. By temporarily dissolving the ego, the defended, armoured sense of self that patients spent years trying to get around in conventional therapy, ketamine could create a window of radical openness, a period during which psychological material that normally couldn't be accessed became reachable. They called it K-therapy, informally, quietly, with no regulatory approval and no published protocols. Therapists in the Bay Area and Los Angeles were administering ketamine to patients in private sessions, pharmaceutical grade, medically sourced, carefully dosed. Sessions lasted an hour. Patients lay on couches with their eyes closed and blankets over them. Therapists sat nearby and guided the experience with gentle verbal prompts that the patient, drifting somewhere between waking and elsewhere, would respond to from a depth of interior access that ordinary consciousness rarely permitted. The results, according to the therapist who kept records, were sometimes extraordinary. Patients who had been in therapy for years without movement reported single sessions producing shifts that felt, to them, like years of progress compressed into 40 minutes. Trauma that had been intellectually acknowledged but emotionally inaccessible suddenly became workable. One therapist described treating a patient who had been unable to discuss the death of her child for 6 years. After one ketamine session, the woman could speak about it directly, specifically, without dissociation. None of this was published. All of it was illegal in the sense that ketamine was not approved for psychiatric use, only anesthetic use. The practitioners involved understood the risk. They practiced carefully, selectively, in near total secrecy. And then the rave scene found it. The transition was not sudden, and it was not simple, but it followed a comprehensible path. Ketamine was a pharmaceutical product, not a street-manufactured drug, which meant its entry into recreational culture required access to the legitimate supply chain rather than a clandestine laboratory. Hospital diversion had already demonstrated that the supply chain was permeable. By the late 1980s, veterinary ketamine had become a secondary source. The drug was widely used in animal surgery, and veterinary supply was even less tightly monitored than hospital stock. The recreational product was chemically identical to the clinical product, because it was the clinical product. The rave scene was the right place at the right time to receive it. Ecstasy, MDMA, had exploded through European and American youth culture in the mid-1980s, transforming nightlife into something that felt, to the people inside it, like a collective spiritual event. Warehouses full of people moving together for hours, the usual social barriers dissolved by a drug that made strangers feel like family. When the ecstasy supply began to be cut with increasingly unpredictable compounds in the late 1980s, The scene didn't contract, it diversified. Ketamine arrived as a companion drug, something to use alongside or instead of ecstasy, and its properties suited the environment with an almost suspicious precision. At low doses, significantly below the anesthetic threshold, ketamine produced euphoria, distortion of time perception, and a feeling of profound connection to music and to other people. The dissociation was partial, pleasurable, social. Users described feeling as though the music was moving through them rather than at them. They described losing track of how long they'd been dancing without losing track of their feet. At higher doses, the experience changed categorically. The K-hole. The term emerged organically from the culture and spread faster than any clinical description could. A K-hole was what happened when the dose crossed from recreational into something else, when the dissociation became complete, when the ego didn't bend but broke, when the user stopped being a person at a party and became a point of awareness suspended in a space that had no floor or ceiling or time. Users described it in terms that were almost indistinguishable from the near-death experiences documented in clinical literature. The sensation of the self leaving the body, of encountering presences, of understanding something vast and then losing the understanding the moment consciousness returned. Some users sought the K-hole deliberately, some stumbled into it by accident and never fully came back from the experience psychologically. Most treated it as the outer boundary of acceptable use, something that happened if you weren't careful, to be avoided or approached with ritual caution. Nobody was tracking the doses, nobody was tracking the frequency, nobody was there afterward to ask the right questions. Rosa Melendez knew none of this in 1991. She'd left hospital nursing 3 years earlier and opened a small home healthcare practice in San Antonio. Chronic illness management, post-surgical follow-up, the kind of close, sustained patient care that institutional nursing rarely allowed. She was good at it. Her patients trusted her completely. She kept her spiral notebook, its pages dense with observations, in the same scrubs pocket it had always lived in. Her son Marco was 19 that year, studying music at a college in Austin, guitar and composition, which Rosa had never fully understood but had supported without reservation, because his face when he played was the same face he'd worn as a small child, when something genuinely delighted him. He came home for Christmas in 1991 and something was different. Not dramatically different, not alarmingly different, just shifted. He was quieter than she remembered. He ate less at dinner. He laughed at the right moments, but a half-second late, as though processing from a small distance. Rosa was a nurse with 20 years of clinical observation behind her. She noticed. She said nothing. He told her everything was fine. He told her Austin was good, the program was good, his friends were interesting people. He said it all smoothly, without hesitation, which should have been reassuring and wasn't. Rosa watched him and kept her own counsel, and drove him back to Austin after the holiday, and hugged him at the curb outside his building. On the flight back to San Antonio, she made a note in her spiral notebook. It was not a clinical observation. It was 4 words. Something is not right. What she didn't know yet, what no one outside a specific cultural network knew yet, was that ketamine had reached Austin's music scene sometime in 1990. Moving through house parties and late-night studios and the particular social world that forms around young musicians who are awake at 3 a.m. and open to anything that might crack the ceiling on ordinary experience. Marco Melendez had encountered it at a party in October of that year. He had described it afterward to a friend as the most significant thing that had ever happened to him. He had used it 6 more times before Christmas. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, something was happening that Western medicine would not notice for another decade. Youth emergency rooms in the new territories were beginning to see a pattern. Young people in their late teens and early 20s presenting with urinary symptoms so severe they required hospitalization, frequency, pain, incontinence, blood. The symptoms resembled advanced bladder disease in patients 3 times their age. Clinicians ran the standard diagnostics, found no infection, found no tumour, found nothing that fit any existing category. The one thing these patients had in common would not be formally identified and published until 2007. By then, the damage would already be irreversible in hundreds of cases across 4 countries. In 1995, an analyst at the Drug Enforcement Administration in Washington completed a threat assessment of ketamine that had taken 14 months to compile. The document ran to 47 pages. It reviewed the diversion data, the recreational use reports from field offices across the country, the emerging European rave scene intelligence, and the absence of any formal regulatory response to date. The assessment concluded with a specific recommendation: Schedule 1 classification for ketamine, effective immediately. Schedule 1 was the maximum restriction, reserved for drugs the government had determined had no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Heroin was Schedule 1. LSD was Schedule 1. The analyst's argument was methodical and documented. Ketamine's medical necessity did not outweigh its demonstrated abuse trajectory, and the longer scheduling was delayed, the more entrenched recreational use would become. The recommendation went up the chain. It came back down 3 weeks later with a single-line response attached. The recommendation was rejected. The reason given: ketamine was too medically essential to restrict at the Schedule 1 level. Removing it from clinical availability would cause demonstrable harm to burn units, pediatric surgery, and emergency medicine in underserved communities, where it remained the only viable anesthetic option. The analyst who wrote the assessment retired 2 years later. His copy of the 47-page document, with his handwritten marginalia in the side columns, was found in a box of his personal papers donated to a university library in 2009. One note in the margin beside the rejection response was written in different ink than the rest, added later clearly. It read, "We knew. We chose." But the DEA's internal deliberation was invisible to the world outside it. What the world saw was nothing. No scheduling change, no public announcement, no warning. Ketamine remained exactly where it had been. Schedule 3, moderately restricted, medically essential, recreationally available to anyone with access to a hospital supply chain or a veterinary clinic. Marco Melendez was 23 in 1995. He had left music school the previous spring, not failed out, simply stopped attending, in the gradual, undramatic way that things end when a person is no longer quite present enough to continue them. He was living in Austin, working intermittently at a recording studio as a session assistant, playing guitar at open mic nights when he felt up to it. He called his mother on a Tuesday evening in March and told her he was dropping out. He used the past tense. He had already stopped going. He said it casually, as though reporting a weather update. Rosa asked him if he was okay. He said he was fine. She asked again, differently. He said he was tired, just tired, and he would call her at the weekend. She drove to Austin the following morning. His apartment was on the 2nd floor of a building off South Congress Avenue, up a staircase that smelled of cigarettes and old carpet. She knocked. He opened the door. The apartment was very clean. Bare walls, bare surfaces, almost no furniture. A mattress on the floor with neat hospital-cornered sheets. A guitar in the corner with a broken string that hadn't been replaced. A small kitchen with almost nothing in it. One mug, one plate, a box of crackers on the counter. Rosa stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room. 20 years of clinical observation. One broken guitar string. She walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on because she needed something to do with her hands while she figured out what she was looking at. The year 2000 arrived with a regulatory decision that satisfied no one and explained nothing. After 30 years of medical use, after the DEA's rejected internal recommendation, after a decade of rave culture and underground therapy, and Hong Kong emergency rooms filling with teenagers whose bladders were failing for reasons no clinician had yet connected to anything, after all of that, ketamine was placed on Schedule 3, not Schedule 1, which would have restricted it severely, not Schedule 2, which would have placed it alongside morphine and oxycodone under tight prescription controls. Schedule 3, the middle category, moderate abuse potential, accepted medical use, prescription required but renewable, refillable, manageable. The scheduling was presented publicly as a measured response to emerging recreational use. What it actually represented was a compromise between two institutional imperatives that could not be simultaneously satisfied: the need to signal concern about abuse and the need to preserve clinical access for the burn units and pediatric wards and rural emergency rooms that had built their entire anesthetic infrastructure around this one molecule. The DEA chose clinical access. The compromise was Schedule 3. The recreational culture absorbed the news and continued without interruption. But something else happened in the year 2000 that the scheduling announcement completely overshadowed. Something that, in retrospect, would matter far more than the regulatory category ketamine was assigned to. It happened not in Washington but in New Haven, Connecticut, inside a Yale University research facility, in the office of a psychiatrist named Dr. John Crystal. Crystal had spent most of the 1990s studying the neuroscience of schizophrenia, using ketamine as a research tool, administering controlled doses to healthy volunteers, and measuring the cognitive effects, trying to understand how NMDA receptor disruption produced symptoms that resembled psychosis. The research was methodical, careful, and pointed in a specific direction. But somewhere in that data, Crystal had noticed something that wasn't about schizophrenia at all. In some of his subjects, volunteers who entered the study without any history of depression, the controlled ketamine doses produced a brief, dramatic shift in mood. Not euphoria in the recreational sense, something more specific, the lifting of a weight the subjects hadn't reported carrying. A sudden, temporary clarity, a sense of possibility where there had been none. The effect lasted hours, sometimes a day. Then it faded. Crystal redirected. He designed a new study, this time recruiting patients with treatment-resistant depression, people who had tried multiple antidepressants without response, who had been in the darkest category of psychiatric illness for years without meaningful relief. He administered a single low dose of intravenous ketamine and measured the results. The results were, by the standards of psychiatric research, almost incomprehensible. Within hours, not days, not weeks, but hours, the majority of patients showed significant reduction in depressive symptoms. Some described it as the first time in years they'd felt anything other than the specific grey flatness that treatment-resistant depression produces. One patient, a woman who'd been unable to leave her apartment without effort for 3 years, drove herself to a grocery store the morning after her infusion and stood in the produce section for 20 minutes, touching the vegetables, relearning what it felt like to have preferences. The standard antidepressants, SSRIs, SNRIs, the drugs that had dominated psychiatry since the late 1980s, worked by gradually increasing serotonin availability in the brain. Gradually. The clinical term was delayed onset. Patients typically waited 2 to 6 weeks before experiencing any mood change, during which time their suicide risk remained elevated, their suffering continued, and their faith in treatment eroded. Ketamine bypassed the serotonin system entirely. It hit the glutamate system, the NMDA receptors, the same mechanism that produced surgical dissociation, and the effect on mood was not delayed. It was immediate. Crystal published in 2000. The paper was precise, carefully worded, statistically sound. It appeared in a respected journal. It was by every measure a legitimate scientific finding that should have reshaped psychiatric research priorities overnight. Almost no one in the psychiatric establishment read it. That is not hyperbole. Citation counts for Crystal's 2000 paper remained negligible for 3 years after publication, a fate common to findings that arrive ahead of the conceptual framework needed to understand them. The psychiatric community was deeply invested in the serotonin model of depression. The NMDA hypothesis required rethinking not just the mechanism, but the entire pharmacological paradigm the field had operated within for a generation. The paper sat in the literature like a message in a bottle, waiting for someone to open it. Crystal applied for NIH funding to continue the research. The grant was denied. The reviewer's comments cited ketamine's abuse potential as a barrier to further investigation. The same drug the DEA had just decided was medically essential was simultaneously being deemed too dangerous to study as a psychiatric treatment. He applied again, denied again. He applied a third time, refining the application, adding safety protocols, narrowing the research scope. The third denial arrived on a Thursday. He filed it, opened a new grant application form and started over. Rosa Melendez knew nothing about John Crystal in the year 2000. She was 57 years old and had been running her home healthcare practice in San Antonio for 12 years. Marco was 28. He had moved back to San Antonio from Austin 2 years earlier. Not home, not his mother's house, but a small apartment 6 blocks away. He was working at a music store teaching guitar to children on weekday afternoons. He seemed stable. That was the word Rosa used in her own mind, with the careful precision of someone who understood what stable actually meant clinically. Not good, not recovered, but not actively falling. She had found what she believed was ketamine in his apartment during a visit in 1998. A small amber vial, pharmaceutical, half empty, in a shoebox under his bathroom sink. She had recognized it immediately. The vial format, the label, the viscosity of the liquid visible through the glass. She had stood in his bathroom for a long time holding the vial. Then she put it back exactly where she found it, at the same angle, and walked back to the kitchen and finished making coffee. She'd not told him what she found. She'd not told anyone. That decision, made in a bathroom in San Antonio in 1998, was the weight she carried into the year 2000 and every year afterward. She'd spent her career administering this drug to heal people. She had watched it work on children with burns, on trauma victims, on soldiers who needed to survive the jungle long enough to reach a surgeon. And now she stood in her son's apartment with evidence that it had become something entirely different in his life, and the only thing she could find to do with that knowledge was put it back in the shoebox and make coffee. Marco's stability in 2000 was real, but it was narrow. He taught guitar. He called his mother on Sundays. He ate dinner with her on the first Saturday of every month, always at the same Vietnamese restaurant on Commerce Street, always ordering the same thing. Rosa watched him across the table each time with the attention she had once given to post-operative patients, tracking the small indicators, the quality of eye contact, the speed of response, the whether he was present or not that was visible in the half-second before he chose to perform being present. Some months he was there, some months he wasn't. What neither of them knew, what the scheduling announcement hadn't addressed, what Crystal's unread paper hadn't yet reached, was that the story of ketamine was about to be rewritten from a direction no one was watching. Not from the DEA, not from the rave scene, not from the psychiatric research community, from a pharmaceutical archive in Edinburgh, Scotland, where a researcher named Dr. Stuart Gibbons had just opened a filing box that wasn't supposed to be interesting. Gibbons was 41 years old, a pharmacologist at the University of Edinburgh working on a study of historical pharmaceutical development practices, specifically the gap between internal industry knowledge and public disclosure. His research required trawling through decades of archived corporate documents from pharmaceutical companies, most of which had been donated to university libraries during mergers and acquisitions. The work was slow and largely unrewarding. Most of what he found was exactly what it appeared to be: routine internal correspondence about manufacturing tolerances and marketing budgets. The Park Davis archive box was labelled, on the outside, CI Series Compound Documentation, 1980 to 1987. Gibbons opened it because it was next in sequence, not because he expected anything significant. Inside, beneath a stack of manufacturing quality control reports, was a memorandum dated February 1985. The heading identified it as an internal communication from Park Davis's Medical Affairs Division to its executive leadership. The subject line read, CI 581 Recreational Use, Risk Assessment Summary. CI 581 was the original research designation for ketamine. Gibbons read the memo twice before he understood what he was holding. The document was a formal internal risk assessment, prepared by the company's own medical team, analysing the evidence of ketamine's recreational use and its potential for compulsive self-administration. It cited internal reports, field observations from company sales representatives, and a review of available literature. Its conclusions were unambiguous. The memo stated explicitly that ketamine's dissociative properties presented, and this was the exact phrase, underlined in the original, significant potential for non-medical self-administration among individuals with access to pharmaceutical supply chains, including healthcare workers. The document was dated 1985, 15 years before scheduling, 11 years before the DEA's own analysts reached the same conclusion and were overruled. Park Davis had known, not suspected, known formally with documentation, signed by the Medical Affairs Director and stamped with a distribution list that included the company's legal department and its chief executive. Not one word of it had been disclosed to the FDA, not one word to the DEA. The memo had travelled from Park Davis to Warner Lambert, which acquired the company in 1970, and then to Pfizer, which acquired Warner Lambert in 2000, the same year ketamine was finally scheduled, the same year the drug changed corporate hands for the second time. The memo had moved with the filing boxes. It had never moved toward a regulator. Gibbons photographed every page. He then did something that would have seemed obvious, but in the culture of academic pharmacology in 2001 was actually a deliberate choice. He immediately contacted a journalist. His paper, published in a pharmacology history journal in 2003, attracted modest academic attention and almost no mainstream press. It was cited in a subsequent legal proceeding involving Pfizer, a proceeding that was settled out of court with terms that were sealed. The sealed settlement meant that the implications of the 1985 memo were never fully aired in a public forum. The memo itself was real, the timeline was real, and the timeline meant something specific. Every regulatory decision made about ketamine between 1985 and 2000, every rejection of scheduling recommendations, every public statement about the drug's safety profile, every year that passed while the recreational culture embedded itself deeper, had occurred in a context where the manufacturer already possessed evidence of abuse potential and had chosen not to share it. That was the architecture underneath everything else. The burn units and the raves and the DEA memos and the unread psychiatric papers, all of it had been built on a foundation that included a document in a filing box that said, in plain corporate language, that the people who made this drug knew what it was becoming. And while Gibbons was reading that memo in Edinburgh, while Crystal was filing his third denied grant application in New Haven, something was happening simultaneously in the neuroscience of depression that would make both of those stories look, in retrospect, like the opening moves of a much larger collision. The question of why standard antidepressants took weeks to work had bothered researchers for decades. The serotonin hypothesis, increased serotonin, reduced depression, was well established but mechanistically incomplete. The drugs worked for many patients, but nobody could fully explain why the benefit was delayed so dramatically when the serotonin increase occurred within hours of the first dose. Something else was happening downstream of the serotonin change, something that took weeks to develop, and whatever that something was, it was the actual mechanism of recovery. In 2003, a research team in Connecticut, not at Yale, at a separate institution, published a study identifying that mechanism. Antidepressants, they found, worked by gradually stimulating the growth of new synaptic connections in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, the brain regions most damaged by chronic depression. The process was called synaptogenesis. It was slow, which explained the delay. It was also, the team noted almost as an aside, dramatically accelerated by compounds that affected the glutamate system, compounds like ketamine. The same year that study was published, the replication of the rejected Stanford primate research was finally completed, 23 years after the original study, with a sample size large enough to satisfy any reviewer. The findings confirmed what the 1980 data had suggested. Repeated ketamine exposure produced measurable changes in prefrontal cortex architecture. The changes were not necessarily destructive. At low doses, in controlled settings, they resembled the structural changes associated with antidepressant response. At high doses with repeated exposure, they resembled something else. Two studies published in the same year, pointing in opposite directions from the same mechanism. Ketamine was simultaneously the thing that broke the brain and the thing that might fix it. The dose was everything. The context was everything. And nobody, not the clinicians, not the regulators, not the researchers, had yet figured out how to hold both of those truths at once. Marco Melendez was hospitalized for the first time in November 2003. The discharge paperwork listed the reason as substance-induced psychotic episode. He was 31 years old. The attending psychiatrist noted in his chart that the patient was oriented to person and place, but demonstrated significant dissociative ideation and flat affect. The chart also noted that the patient's mother, listed as emergency contact, arrived within 40 minutes of the call and remained in the waiting room for 6 hours without leaving. Rosa sat in that waiting room with her coat on and her hands folded in her lap and her spiral notebook in her bag, unopened. There was nothing to observe that she wanted to write down. When the psychiatrist came out to speak with her, he mentioned that Marco had disclosed ketamine use, regular, ongoing, at doses significantly above recreational range. The psychiatrist used the word dependent. Rosa nodded. She already knew the word. She had used it clinically for 20 years, always about other people's children. The psychiatrist said there was no established treatment protocol for ketamine dependence, no medication, no specific therapeutic approach, no clinical guideline. The field didn't have one. Rosa looked at him for a moment. She asked what they were supposed to do. He told her they would do what they could. The first patient in the United Kingdom to have his bladder surgically removed as a result of ketamine use was 26 years old. His name does not appear in the published case study. He's identified only as Patient A in a 2007 paper in the journal BJU International, a urology publication that had never previously had reason to discuss a recreational drug. The paper described his history with clinical precision. 4 years of regular ketamine use, beginning at age 22, initially at weekend frequencies and escalating to daily use by year 2. The urinary symptoms had begun in year 3: urgency, frequency, pain severe enough to wake him from sleep. He had seen 2 GPs and a urologist before anyone thought to ask about drug use. When the question was finally asked and answered, the urologist ordered an imaging scan. The scan showed a bladder that had contracted to a fraction of its normal capacity. The walls were thickened with scar tissue, the lining inflamed beyond recovery. The organ had been, in the paper's careful phrasing, rendered non-functional by chronic chemical insult. There was no treatment for tissue that damaged. The bladder was removed. The patient was fitted with a urostomy bag. He was 26 years old and would manage that bag for the rest of his life. The 2007 paper identified 15 similar cases in UK hospitals, all young, all recreational ketamine users, all presenting with a urological profile that had no precedent in the clinical literature, because no clinician had ever thought to look for a connection between a dissociative anaesthetic and bladder destruction. The mechanism, once researchers began looking for it, was identifiable. Ketamine and its metabolites, the compounds the liver breaks down ketamine into, are excreted through the urinary tract. In a body processing occasional low-dose ketamine, this is manageable. In a body processing daily high-dose ketamine, the metabolites accumulate in the bladder lining at concentrations that cause direct toxic damage to the tissue. Repeated exposure means repeated damage. Repeated damage means progressive scarring. Progressive scarring means a bladder that shrinks, stiffens, and eventually stops functioning entirely. The condition had a name now: ketamine cystitis. The name arrived 47 years after the drug's synthesis and 37 years after its FDA approval. In Hong Kong, where clinicians had been seeing these cases since the late 1990s, the 2007 paper confirmed what they had long suspected and could now formally document. The response was immediate: public health campaigns, hospital protocols, urgent research into whether any intervention could halt the progression once it began. The answer, for advanced cases, was that it could not. Abstinence in early stages could stabilize the damage. Beyond a certain point, the trajectory was fixed. What made this finding uniquely devastating was its invisibility during use. Ketamine cystitis developed silently, over years, without the dramatic acute warning signals that other drug harms produced. An overdose announces itself. Liver failure has stages visible in blood work. Ketamine's bladder damage accumulated quietly, symptom-free in its early phases, until the damage was already extensive. Users had no way to know. Clinicians who didn't know to ask had no way to know either. The UK government launched a public awareness campaign in 2009. Billboards, school programmes, a dedicated page on the NHS website. The campaign was accurate, well-designed, and reached its intended audience with measurable efficiency. The recreational ketamine culture absorbed the information and continued. Use rates among young adults in the UK did not significantly decline in the years following the campaign. What declined, marginally, was the average age of first use. Younger users apparently were beginning earlier, before the public health messaging had the opportunity to reach them. This was the world in 2010. And 2010 was the year that 2 entirely separate crises, the recreational damage documented in British urology wards and Hong Kong emergency rooms, and the psychiatric research that Crystal had been pursuing through years of denied funding, finally collided with enough institutional force to produce an outcome. The NIH funded Crystal's research. After a decade of applications, after 3 explicit denials, after the publication of the synaptogenesis findings and the replicated primate study, and a growing body of international research pointing in the same direction from different angles, The funding came through. It was not a small grant. It was a multi-site clinical trial, the most rigorous test of ketamine's antidepressant properties yet designed, involving hundreds of patients across multiple research centres and a protocol that addressed every safety concern the previous rejection letters cited. The trial results, published between 2012 and 2014 across several papers, were consistent in a way that clinical trials rarely achieved. Ketamine produced rapid, significant antidepressant effects in treatment-resistant patients, at a rate that ranged from 60 to 70% response. For context, treatment-resistant depression was defined as depression that had already failed to respond to at least 2 different antidepressant regimens. These were patients the existing system had already tried and failed to help. Ketamine helped most of them, within hours. The suicide data was particularly striking. In patients with active suicidal ideation, the most urgent, most dangerous presentation in psychiatric emergency, a single ketamine infusion produced measurable reduction in suicidal thinking within 40 minutes. Standard protocols for suicidal patients involved hospitalization, monitoring, and a wait of weeks for medications to take effect. 40 minutes was not a medical improvement on that standard. It was a different category of intervention entirely. The psychiatric establishment, which had largely ignored Crystal's 2000 paper, could not ignore a multi-site clinical trial with hundreds of patients and replicated results. The conversation shifted, slowly, resistantly, with the institutional friction that characterizes any paradigm under pressure, but it shifted. Marco Melendez had his second hospitalization in April 2010, 7 years after the first. The interval was not 7 years of stability. It was 7 years of the narrow, managed, precarious existence that sits between crises when there is no adequate treatment available. He had been through 2 outpatient rehabilitation programs, both built around frameworks designed for opioid or alcohol dependence and adapted imperfectly for ketamine. He had periods of abstinence. The longest ran to 14 months, ending in the winter of 2007 for reasons he described to his counselor as nothing specific. Nothing specific was its own kind of specific. The second hospitalization followed a period of resumed use that his counselor had been tracking with increasing concern for 3 months. Marco had not been hiding it, or not hiding it effectively, which amounted to the same thing to Rosa, who had learned to read the tells with the fluency of long practice, the slight lag in phone responses, the way he held his coffee cup during their Saturday dinners with both hands around it, not drinking, just holding. The guitar, which she had replaced twice as a gesture towards something she couldn't name directly, sitting again in the corner of his apartment with a broken string. The second hospitalization was different from the first in one significant way. The attending psychiatrist, a younger doctor who had been following the emerging research literature, mentioned to Rosa in the family consultation that there was a treatment being studied, experimental, not yet approved, but showing results unlike anything in the existing toolkit. She described the mechanism briefly. She said the word ketamine. Rosa's face did something in that moment that the psychiatrist noticed but couldn't interpret. It was not surprise. It was not the reaction of someone hearing a new word. It was the reaction of someone hearing a word they had lived inside for 30 years arrive in a completely unexpected room. She asked the doctor to repeat what the treatment was. The doctor repeated it. Rosa looked at the table between them for a long moment. The drug she had administered to 7-year-olds with burns, to veterans who came back wrong from the experience, the drug she'd found in a shoebox under her son's bathroom sink and put back at the same angle. The drug that had dismantled Marco's life one quiet increment at a time. That drug was now being described to her as the potential answer. Not a different drug, not a better version. The same molecule, a different context, a different dose, a different intention. She asked whether Marco would be a candidate. The doctor said not yet. The protocols weren't established for patients with his specific history of dependence. It would be complicated. There were questions about whether the therapeutic mechanism could be separated from the compulsive one, whether offering ketamine to someone with a ketamine dependence history was a treatment or a provocation. Those questions did not yet have answers. The research was still running. While Rosa drove home from that consultation, something was happening in a boardroom in New Jersey that would reshape every answer the research eventually produced. Johnson & Johnson's pharmaceutical division had been monitoring the ketamine antidepressant research since at least 2010. What they had identified was not simply a promising clinical finding, it was a specific opportunity. Ketamine itself was off patent, synthesized in 1962, manufacturable by any pharmaceutical company for pennies per dose. No company could profit from ketamine as a depression treatment, because no company owned it. But a modified version of ketamine, a mirror image molecule called esketamine, technically distinct from ketamine in its molecular handedness, could potentially be patented, developed, and sold as a branded pharmaceutical product. The clinical profile of esketamine was similar to ketamine. The mechanism was identical. The antidepressant effect appeared equivalent. The difference was that esketamine had never been approved for anything, which meant it could be taken through the FDA approval process as a novel compound, granted patent protection, and priced accordingly. Johnson & Johnson acquired the esketamine license and filed for FDA Breakthrough Therapy designation in 2013. The designation, reserved for drugs that showed substantial improvement over existing treatments for serious conditions, was granted. It accelerated the approval timeline and signaled that the FDA considered the finding credible and urgent. The clinical trials for esketamine ran through the mid-2000s. The results were consistent with the broader ketamine literature. The FDA approved esketamine, branded as Spravato, in March 2019. The press release described it as the first new class of antidepressant approved in over 50 years. That was accurate. What the press release did not address was the price. A single session of Spravato, one dose, administered in a certified clinical setting, with the mandatory monitoring period that the FDA required, cost $800. The approved treatment protocol called for twice-weekly sessions for the first month, then weekly sessions for the second month, then bi-weekly maintenance. At full protocol, the first 3 months of treatment cost approximately $10,000. Insurance coverage was inconsistent, often denied, and when granted frequently contested on prior authorization grounds. 4 ketamine infusions at the private clinics, using the original off-patent drug administered off-label for depression, cost between $400 and $800 per session, and were almost universally excluded from insurance coverage because off-label use was not a covered indication. The patients who needed the treatment most, the treatment-resistant, the suicidal, the ones who had already failed every affordable option, were the patients least likely to have the financial resources to access it. In rural and underserved communities, where ketamine had first made its mark as the democratizing anesthetic, the drug that brought surgical care to places that couldn't afford anesthesiologists, its reincarnation as a depression treatment was arriving at prices that those same communities had no means to pay. The breakthrough belonged to everyone in the press release. In practice, it belonged to whoever could write the check. Rosa Melendez turned 67 that year. She'd been a nurse for over 4 decades and had spent the last 20 years watching the same molecule move through her profession and her family in directions that seemed, at each stage, impossible to have predicted from the previous one. She'd read about the FDA approval on her laptop in her kitchen on a Tuesday morning, over coffee, in a news alert she'd set up months earlier for the word ketamine, a habit she'd developed sometime around Marco's second hospitalization and never discontinued. She read the article twice. She noted the price. She opened a new browser tab and looked up the income guidelines for the patient assistance program mentioned in the article's final paragraph. The guidelines were specific. Marco, on his part-time income, would qualify for reduced-cost access, not free, not simple, requiring documentation and applications and the specific bureaucratic endurance that ill people often had the least of. She printed the page. She folded it into the front pocket of the bag she brought to their Saturday dinners. She would wait for the right moment. Marco was 37 years old. He had not been hospitalized since 2010. He was working 3 days a week at the music store. He called his mother on Sundays, usually in the early evening, and the calls lasted between 8 and 20 minutes, depending on something she had never been able to fully identify or predict. She measured the quality of his weeks in those minutes without meaning to. What she didn't know, what the printed page in her bag couldn't yet tell her, was that the right moment was already overdue, and that the treatment she was carefully researching for her son was about to become available in a form no one had anticipated, through a program that had not yet been announced, inside an institution that had once been the last place either of them would have looked. What changed after 2019 was not the drug. The drug was identical to what Calvin Stevens had synthesized in 1962. What changed was the institutional permission structure around it, and that change, once it moved fast. By 2020, the number of ketamine infusion clinics in the United States had crossed 400. By 2022, it was over 750. The growth rate had no precedent in the history of American specialty medicine, not because the underlying need was new, but because the need had existed for decades without a legal, accessible delivery mechanism, and the moment one appeared, the demand was already there, waiting. Treatment-resistant depression affected an estimated 17 million Americans. The existing psychiatric toolkit had failed all of them by definition. Ketamine clinics opened into that vacuum, the way water moves into a depression in the ground, not with force, simply with inevitability. The clinics were not regulated as a category. Each operated under the general medical licensing of its supervising physician, with ketamine prescribed off-label for depression under the same legal framework that allowed any doctor to prescribe any approved drug for any condition they judged clinically appropriate. There was no federal standard for the infusion protocol, no mandated follow-up period, no required outcome tracking. A clinic in Austin, Texas, and a clinic in Portland, Oregon might administer the same drug at entirely different doses in entirely different settings, with entirely different screening criteria for patient eligibility, and neither would be in violation of any specific regulation. Some clinics were exceptional. Rigorous screening, trained therapists present during infusions, structured integration sessions afterward, careful follow-up protocols. Some were not. The market, which had materialized faster than any regulatory framework could follow, sorted patients by zip code and insurance status as much as by clinical need. The VA system, the network of hospitals serving American military veterans, the same population that had first received ketamine in Vietnamese jungles in 1970, began formally studying ketamine-assisted therapy for PTSD in 2018. The early results were consistent with the depression literature: rapid symptom reduction, high response rates, an effect profile unlike anything in the existing VA pharmacological toolkit. By 2021, several VA medical centers were offering ketamine infusions through formal clinical protocols. The drug had completed a specific circle, from the soldiers who first received it in the field to the veterans' hospitals that had no adequate treatment for what the field had done to their minds, back to ketamine as a potential answer. The circle was not lost on anyone paying attention. What the VA programs also documented carefully and publicly was the complication that Rosa's psychiatrist had identified in 2010. The question of ketamine's therapeutic use in patients with substance use histories. The VA patient population included a significant proportion of veterans with histories of alcohol or drug dependence, co-occurring conditions that were, in the PTSD population, the norm rather than the exception. The research teams developed screening protocols, exclusion criteria, monitoring frameworks. Some patients with dependence histories were excluded. Some were included with enhanced oversight. The data was still being collected. Marco Melendez entered a ketamine-assisted therapy program in March 2021. Not through the VA, he was not a veteran. Not through a private clinic. The cost, even with patient assistance, was beyond what his circumstances could sustain across a full protocol. The program he entered was affiliated with a university research hospital in San Antonio that had been running a pilot study specifically designed for the population his psychiatrist had described to Rosa in 2010, patients with treatment-resistant depression and a documented history of ketamine dependence. The design of the study was careful in ways that reflected everything the research community had learned and failed to learn across 50 years. The drug was administered orally rather than intravenously, a lower bioavailability route that produced a gentler, more controllable effect, reducing the intensity of the dissociative experience while preserving the antidepressant mechanism. Sessions were conducted in a clinical room, not a reclining chair with headphones, but a quiet space with a trained therapist present throughout. Each infusion was followed by a 90-minute structured session in which the therapist guided the patient through whatever psychological material the drug had surfaced. The dose was calibrated individually. The protocol ran for 12 weeks. The study's hypothesis was specific, that the same mechanism which made ketamine pharmacologically compelling to people with depression, the rapid disruption of rigid, self-reinforcing thought patterns, the temporary dissolution of the defended self, was also the mechanism that had made it compelling to people like Marco outside clinical settings. The difference between therapeutic use and compulsive use was not the drug's action on the brain. It was the presence or absence of a structured container around that action. Marco attended every session. Rosa drove him to the first 4 before he told her, carefully but firmly, that he could drive himself. She agreed. She sat in her kitchen on those mornings and did other things with her hands, watered plants, reorganized shelves, and waited for him to text her when it was done. His psychiatrist, a woman named Dr. Priya Nair, who had been treating Marco for 3 years before the study enrollment, described his response in clinical notes that would later be included, anonymized, in the study's published dataset. At week 4, she noted, marked reduction in anhedonia and psychomotor retardation. At week 8, patient reports first sustained period of voluntary social engagement in approximately 7 years. At week 10, she wrote a single observation that departed slightly from standard clinical language. Patient brought guitar to session and played for approximately 15 minutes, unprompted. He relapsed in September 2021, 6 months after completing the protocol, a single episode lasting 4 days, followed by voluntary disclosure to Dr. Nair and immediate re-engagement with the outpatient support structure. The relapse was documented, addressed, and built into the ongoing treatment plan without the crisis framing that had surrounded every previous episode. He didn't relapse again for 14 months. Rosa found out about the September relapse 3 weeks after it happened, when Marco told her himself during a Sunday phone call. The call lasted 34 minutes. She noted the length without meaning to. Across the Atlantic, the British public health response to ketamine cystitis had evolved from awareness campaigns into something more systematic. NHS urology departments had developed specific intake protocols for young patients presenting with urinary symptoms. The standard screening now included recreational drug use as a primary diagnostic consideration rather than an afterthought. Bladder removal cases had not stopped, but early intervention was identifying patients at reversible stages, and sustained abstinence was being shown in a growing body of evidence to halt the progression before surgical intervention became necessary. The recreational culture had not disappeared. It had not even substantially contracted. What had changed was the clinical response to it. Faster recognition, better informed GPS, a urology workforce that no longer needed the 2007 paper to know what ketamine cystitis looked like. Medicine had adapted to the harm it had spent decades not looking for. In 2022, Rosa agreed to speak at a continuing nursing education conference in San Antonio, a day-long event covering emerging pharmacological developments, attended by several hundred nurses from across Texas. She'd been invited because of her clinical history with ketamine stretching back to 1975, which the conference organizers had described as unique longitudinal perspective. She spent 3 weeks preparing her presentation. She pulled out her old spiral notebooks, there were 11 of them by then, spanning 4 decades, and reread them cover to cover for the first time. The 7-year-old boy with burns on his left arm and shoulder, who had held out his arm for the IV by the 7th procedure. The veteran who had come back from the ketamine experience somewhere worse than where he'd been. The vial in the shoebox under Marco's bathroom sink, which she had replaced at the exact angle she found it. The psychiatrist who had shown her the pamphlet in the hospital waiting room, not knowing that she'd spent 20 years of her career with that molecule in her hands. She assembled her presentation without a single slide that contained the word failure. The language she used throughout was clinical, precise, and carefully chosen. She described what the drug had done and what it had not done and what remained unknown. She described the neurological mechanism in terms that the nurses in the audience, most of them 30 years younger than her, could follow without prior pharmacology training. At the end, she described her son, not by name, not with identifying details, just the broad outline, a family member, a long history, a current status that she characterized as ongoing recovery, 14 months without relapse, working 3 days a week, calling his mother on Sundays. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when a speaker has said something that cost them something real. Someone in the audience raised a hand and asked whether, given everything she knew and everything she had seen, Rosa believed the drug's benefits outweighed its harms. She stood at the podium for a long moment. The question was not answerable in the way the asker intended, with a clean yes or no, a clinical verdict, a bottom line. She knew that. The room waited. She said something. The microphone was beginning to cut out at that distance, and the recording later uploaded to the conference archive captured only the first few words clearly before the audio degraded. What was audible was, for some people, at the right moment. The rest was lost. Go back to the beginning. Not to 1962, not to the Detroit laboratory, not to Calvin Stevens and his dated journal entries. Go back to the first image, the one that opened this story. A ketamine clinic opening every 34 hours in 2023. That number looked, at the start, like evidence of a drug out of control. A molecule that had escaped every container medicine tried to put it in, spreading through culture and crisis until it was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, legal and illegal, healing and destroying all at once. That was how it felt from the outside. A paradox, a system failure, something that shouldn't have been allowed to happen. It looks different now. The clinic opening every 34 hours is not evidence of a drug out of control. It is evidence of a need that was always there, that medicine failed to meet for decades, that an old molecule is now being asked to address because nothing newer has proven adequate. The 17 million Americans with treatment-resistant depression did not appear in 2019. They existed in 1989, in 1999, in 2009. Sitting in psychiatrists' offices, cycling through medications that didn't work, waiting the 2 to 6 weeks that every new prescription required, watching the weeks pass without the weightlifting, trying again. The clinics are opening because the waiting rooms were already full. They had just been full in silence. The field medic in the Vietnamese jungle in 1970 knew one thing about ketamine. It kept a man alive on the jungle floor long enough to reach surgery. That was the complete extent of its known utility, and it was enough to make it essential. The student in the Manchester warehouse in 1995 knew something different, that the same molecule produced an experience of self-dissolution so complete and so strange that it felt to her like touching something real underneath ordinary consciousness. Those two pieces of knowledge existed in completely separate worlds for 25 years, in separate cultural languages with no bridge between them. The bridge turned out to be neuroscience. The dissociation the medic observed and managed was the same mechanism the raver was deliberately inducing, and the same mechanism the psychiatrist was now carefully calibrating as a therapeutic tool. The jungle floor, the warehouse, the clinical recliner, all three were the same room, seen from different angles in different decades by people who couldn't see each other. Dr. John Crystal is still at Yale. His 2000 paper, which sat largely uncited for 3 years, has now been cited over 2,000 times and is listed in standard psychiatric pharmacology curricula as a foundational document in the history of depression treatment. He has described in interviews the specific texture of the decade he spent submitting and resubmitting grant applications, the accumulated paper of denials, the reviewer comments about abuse potential, the years of working on other projects while the research sat waiting for institutional permission to continue. He does not describe bitterness. He describes the process as simply what happened, in the same tone a geologist might use to describe the time it takes for rock to become something else under pressure. The long-term neurological studies, the ones tracking what repeated therapeutic ketamine exposure does to a brain over 5 to 10 years, are still running. The first generation of patients who received regular infusions for depression in the early 2000s is now at the 10-year mark. Preliminary data is beginning to emerge in preprint form, cautious and appropriately hedged. The findings so far are neither alarming nor fully reassuring. They are, like most things in the actual history of this drug, more complicated than either side of the argument would prefer. Some patients show continued benefit with stable dosing and no measurable adverse neurological markers. Some show gradual tolerance development. The dose that worked for 2 years stops working, requiring escalation that introduces its own questions. A small subset shows cognitive changes, subtle, measurable, the clinical significance of which remains contested among the researchers analysing them. No study yet published has the sample size or the follow-up duration to settle the question definitively. The question remains open in the most literal sense. The data is still being collected, the patients are still being followed, and anyone who claims certainty about the long-term safety profile of therapeutic ketamine is claiming more than the science currently permits. Calvin Stevens died in 1973, 11 years after synthesizing the compound that bore no trace of his name in public memory. He left behind meticulous laboratory notebooks, a small body of published research, and a molecule that would outlast every assumption made about it. There is no evidence he knew, In his final years, what ketamine was becoming outside the clinical settings he had designed it for. His obituary in a pharmaceutical industry publication was 4 sentences long. It mentioned CI 395 briefly. It did not predict anything. Park Davis no longer exists as an independent company. Warner Lambert absorbed it, and Pfizer absorbed Warner Lambert, and the 1985 memo that Dr. Stuart Gibbons found in the Edinburgh archive became a footnote in a sealed legal settlement that no one outside the proceeding ever read in full. The DEA analyst who recommended Schedule 1 in 1995 and received a one-line rejection is retired, his annotated copy of the 47-page assessment sitting in a university library where it has been requested by researchers 4 times in 15 years. The Ohio nurse who diverted ketamine from hospital supply in the late 1970s, who described using it to feel like herself again, who was fired and whose case was never published, was the first documented case of therapeutic self-medication with a dissociative anesthetic for what almost certainly was treatment-resistant depression. She was treated as a thief, because that was the only available category. 30 years later, what she was doing in that pillow-lined spare bedroom was a rough approximation of what a certified clinic in Houston would charge $800 a session to provide. The approximation was dangerous and unsupervised and obtained through institutional betrayal. The difference between her and a 2023 patient sitting in a reclining chair with an IV drip is not the drug. It is the zip code, the decade, and the presence of a medical license in the room. Marco Melendez is 42 years old. He works 4 days a week now. The music store promoted him to manage the lesson program, which means he hires the teachers and sets the schedules and occasionally, on slow Tuesday afternoons, teaches a beginner guitar class himself. He bought a new guitar 18 months ago. Both strings are intact. He calls his mother on Sundays, still in the early evening, and the calls last between 20 and 40 minutes, depending on what happened that week. Not on something unnameable, not on a distance she has to measure in minutes, just on what happened. He is not cured. That word doesn't apply and never did. He manages a condition that the medical system spent 30 years failing to name correctly, using a treatment that the same system spent 20 years refusing to fund for a drug whose history he knows better than most clinicians, because he's lived inside it in a way no clinical training could replicate. His psychiatrist, doctor. Naya considers him one of her most instructive patients, not because his case was unusual, but because it was so entirely typical of what happens when a serious illness meets an inadequate system across a long period of time. Rosa is 79. She still keeps the spiral notebooks. There are 14 now, the newest only half filled. She stopped practicing nursing formally a decade ago, but still reads every major pharmacology publication that crosses her alert feed, still updates her understanding of ketamine's mechanism whenever a new paper advances it, still holds in her memory the face of the 7-year-old boy who held out his arm for the IV and the veteran who came back from the drug somewhere worse than where he'd started. Both of them are probably in their 50s and 70s now, respectively, and she does not know what became of either of them. She has no way to know. That is the nature of clinical relationships. They end when the chart closes. She thinks about them anyway. There is one number that does not resolve neatly into the story's arc, that does not find its counterweight in research progress, or institutional correction, or the quiet incremental recovery of one man in San Antonio. It sits at the end of this history the way certain facts sit, too large to absorb, too specific to ignore. As of 2024, an estimated 4.5 million people worldwide live with treatment-resistant depression. By definition, standard antidepressants have already failed every one of them. Ketamine, in its various forms, at its various price points, through its various delivery mechanisms, is currently the only fast-acting pharmacological option with robust evidence of efficacy in this population. The waiting lists at ketamine clinics across the United States average between 4 and 6 months. The cost remains prohibitive for the majority of people who qualify clinically, but not financially. The molecule Calvin Stevens synthesized on a Tuesday in 1956, trying to improve on something that had failed catastrophically, has become the last option for millions of people that every other option has already failed. That is not a triumph. It is not a tragedy. It is the actual shape of 60 years of discovery, suppression, accident, crisis, profit, and the specific, unglamorous persistence of researchers who kept submitting grant applications into the silence. The long-term brain studies are still running. The waiting lists are still long. The clinics are still opening. Not every 34 hours anymore, but close. Somewhere tonight, in a reclining chair in a medical park in a city that could be anywhere. A person who has not felt the weight lift in years is 40 minutes into an IV infusion of a drug invented before colour television, and something is beginning to shift. Whether it lasts is the question no one can answer yet. The data is still coming in.